welcome to Books for Beneficiaries. My name is Pete Williams, the host of the program on which we talk about the needs of beneficiaries. In estate planning matters, it is the estate owner that takes center stage, and that, of course, is appropriate. It is, after all, their wealth. However, the beneficiary sometimes is left in the dark as to the process. They have needs and questions. They want to ensure that they have their proper inheritance. So I am hopeful that this series will shed some light and give them some information that will help them. I call this series Books for Beneficiaries. So stay tuned for the next chapter and check back for more to come. Hello and welcome to another edition of Books for Beneficiaries. My name is Pete Williams, the host of the program. And we are going to continue a talk about the Revocable Living Trusts and what it means to beneficiaries who inherit assets from the settlor, the creator of the trust, and how it's done compared to inheriting assets through a probate process. So just to remind everybody, during life, the Revocable Living Trust is amendable and revocable, and it is a pass-through entity for tax purposes. All income just flows right to the creator of the trust. Now, upon death, which we're going to focus in on today, it becomes non-amendable and non-revocable. I'm going to mention one little tangent here, and that is something called a power of appointment. And that's an ability for the settlor of a trust to direct the trustee after death to send assets in a way that's not spelled out in the trust. Let's put it that way. Maybe I'll do a separate episode on powers of appointment. Quite frankly, they're not very often used or seen, but I just want you to know that when I say it's non-revocable, non-amendable, there is a little loophole that called the power of appointment that can be used to sort of amend and redirect assets that is not spelled out in the trust. So, and secondly, it becomes a separate tax-paying entity. It files for its own tax identification number, and it files its own tax return. So during life, when the settlor of the trust has capacity, the creator of the trust is the trustee of his or her own trust. The creator of the trust is also the beneficiary of the trust. All benefits flow to the person who created the trust. On incapacity, as we mentioned before in the prior episode, the creator of the trust is always going to be the creator of the trust. They're also the beneficiary of the trust, but they are not necessarily the trustee. And in fact, if they have incapacity, they are not the trustee. The trust will say, upon incapacity, someone is named as successor trustee. And then upon death, what happens is that the settlor creator is not only not the trustee any longer, the settlor creator of the trust is not the beneficiary. There's now the beneficiary comes into the picture once a death occurs of the creator of the trust. The trustee is someone that's the creator of the trust names. It's either an individual they feel comfortable will handle their affairs when they're gone, or it's an institution. Bank trust departments, for instance, act as trustees of trusts quite often. And the beneficiaries are spelled out, hopefully in a clear fashion, in the trust document. And it is the trustee's responsibility to get with those beneficiaries and to distribute their rightful inheritance. So, upon death in a revocable living trust, the trustee takes over. And typically you will find in a trust document that the settlor has named maybe some backup trustees. So I want my brother to be the successor trustee upon my death. If my brother is unable or unwilling, then I want my sister. If my sister is unable or unwilling, I want the Bank of Podunk, Iowa to be successor trustee of my trust. The trustee takes over the trust assets and they actually go in and they rename trust assets. So they go into a bank, and whereas the bank account may have read John Doe as trustee of the John Doe Trust, now it is going to read Jane Doe as trustee of the John Doe Trust, if John Doe in fact named Jane Doe as his successor trustee. It will still be in the name of the John Doe Trust. Likewise, the successor trustee, Jane Doe in my example, will file deeds on real estate so that there is continuity on ownership of real property. There will be John Doe as trustee of the John Doe Trust. There will be a deed that says John Doe is deceased. Here's a death certificate. Jane Doe is now trustee, and now Jane Doe can sell that property or deal with that property. And in addition to liquid assets, bank accounts, stocks, bonds, as well as real property, it is the trustee's duty to inventory and protect all personal property, household goods, collectibles, things like that. The trustee will determine if there's a need to open a probate. Often in an estate plan that has a revocable living trust as its core document, there is something called a pour-over will. And it's just like it sounds. It's a will that says, if I die, pour everything into my trust. Pour-over will. Pour it over into my trust and let the trust control distribution of those assets. So if I have forgotten something that I did not register in the name of the trust, pour it into the trust. Now, a lot of times that requires a probate if the assets are of a certain size. Each state is different. The trustee then generally does not have any power over beneficiary designated assets, such as pay on death accounts, transfer on death accounts. And this goes with joint tenancy with right of survivorship. It goes also with IRA beneficiary designations. Unless the trust is the beneficiary, the trustee has no power over that asset. Now, an important thing happens at this point upon death. The trustee now has a fiduciary responsibility to the beneficiaries. That means they must abide by good faith rules when it comes to handling assets, and they must preserve assets, and they must make sure that they distribute properly to a beneficiary. So what the trustee is going to do is they're going to make a complete accounting of all assets that belong to the trust. They're going to explain to the beneficiaries the division of the estate. They're going to explain the terms of the payout. Now, oftentimes, assets are just paid out. So the trustee gets the assets, they pay taxes, they pay debts, and then they divide the assets up amongst the named beneficiaries. But that's not always the case. There are occasions when the settlor says, I'm going to hold these assets in trust for a period of time. And certainly for minor beneficiaries. As mentioned, the trustee they'll pay debts. You beneficiaries out there should know that there is a responsibility on the trustee to settle up debts that the decedent had at time of death. So this process can take some time, probably not as long as a probate process, but it does take time. Another thing beneficiaries need to know, there are oftentimes some preliminary distributions before the remainder is divided amongst the main beneficiaries. And sometimes this can cause problems if they're very large. So in other words, settlor dies, and in that trust, it says, pay $100,000 to some charity. Pay $100,000 to my good friend Joe. Pay $100,000 to somebody else. One of the dangers is that sometimes these preliminary distributions can add up to quite a lot if the settlor has, if the settlor's estate has lost value due to, say, for instance, medical expenses in the later years of life. But hopefully the settlor kept up with the dynamics of their situation and were able to perhaps change these distributions when their estate diminished in size. The most common form of distribution is something called per stirpes, or right of representation. And what that does is it leaves assets to beneficiaries and it leaves it in bloodline. One thing you don't want to see in a trust document is that, hey, I leave my assets in equal share to my three children. 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. That does not plan for a contingency if a child dies before the settlor. So what you often see is, to my children an equal share. However, if a child predeceases me, then, and then it goes on to explain what they want. It could be to the issue of the child, to the grandchildren, by right of representation. It could be to the spouse of the child. If, say, a son dies before the settlor, certainly the settlor, the creator of the trust, can leave assets to whomever they want, and if they want to leave it to the spouse of the son, that's fine. The problem is we really don't know who the spouse is of the son at the time of death. So the person that the settlor thought they were going to leave assets to may not be the person that is currently married to their son. So that again is an area that has to be kept up with, and sometimes it's unfortunate that it's not. And if the spouse is named as a successor beneficiary, it can be problematic sometimes if it's not the original spouse. This is often done when a child has young children and the settlor wants to leave it to the spouse to take care of their grandchildren. But there are other ways to do that. It's normally left in bloodline, and that's really what per stirpes means. And by the way, it could be to a charity. A settlor may have 3 children. If one child dies and has no children, leave their 1/3 share to where that child might have left it to. But more often than not, it is left to the children of the predeceasing child. And if there are no children, then it comes back up to the surviving children. And most trusts have sort of a leftover clause. Hey, look, if everything above doesn't work, or there's complications, or there is no identifiable beneficiary, then leave it to my university, something like that. Now let's get back to the terms of the payout. Quite often, it is an immediate payout of an inheritance. So the trustee comes in, they do an inventory, they do an accounting, they pay all taxes, they pay all debts, and then what's left over, they just divided, in my case, a third, if all 3 children are living, and it's an immediate payout. But sometimes the settlor has decided that they want to hold assets in trust. So the language of that trust would read, hey, upon my death, do not pay out immediately outright. Hang on to these assets and hold them, pay interest, pay some expenses for the beneficiary, but hang on to it. And hanging on to it could be at certain ages. So it might even read, hey, pay out when the beneficiary's age 30, just pay it out. It could read when the beneficiary turns age 30, give them half of their inheritance. In another 10 years, give them the other. It could be any scheme that the settlor wants at ages. It could be held in trust for certain conditions. If a settlor has a child that they're a little worried about, and they think that by giving a large inheritance to the child, that the inheritance would be gone in quick order, they could set limits. They could say, pay out only if my child, the one I'm concerned about, has employment, is in school, is doing charitable work, that sort of thing. You can set conditions on the payout. There is something called a unit trust, which again is another little tangent that we will go over in a separate episode. But a unit trust basically says, hey, I'm concerned about my child. I want to pay them out 5, 6, 8% a year of the value of the assets as of December 31st of the prior year. So trustee manages the assets. They determine the value on December 31st, and then for the next year, they pay out, call it 5% of the assets. So pay out my son 5% a year for the rest of his life. Let's just say it's $2 million. And call it the first year, they'll get paid $100,000 that year if assets go up in value. And assets tend to go up over time, so whether it be real estate or the stock market. And then ultimately, there's going to be something left over when the beneficiary dies. There's going to be a contingent beneficiary. So again, what we're talking about is not paying out to the beneficiary, but holding assets in trust. Another way to do that is to have an income trust as opposed to a unit trust. Slightly different. Here, it's just pay out all income to the beneficiary. The trustee has somewhat of a dilemma. They want to invest assets at the highest possible interest rate to give the current beneficiary their payment, but they also want to make sure that they preserve assets for the remainder principal beneficiary when the income beneficiary dies. So that's a tough one. Income trusts are often used for spouses, could be even the second spouse. There could be any number of ways this could be read. But keep my assets in trust, allow my spouse to live in my home for the rest of her life, pay property taxes, pay for repairs, pay her an income off of my liquid assets, and then when she dies, divide the assets up among children. Here's an interesting point that I don't think a lot of people think about, is that the trustee is let's say, responsible for two trust tax returns. And as we mentioned, the trust becomes irrevocable, and it has its own tax ID number, and it is its own tax-paying entity at point of death of the settlor. From that point forward, there's a trust tax return that the trust pays. But because not everybody dies on December 31st at midnight, there's also a period of time in which the settlor owes for that last year taxes for income earned in the year of death. Now, that is usually the responsibility of the executor, but in many, many cases, the executor and the trustee are the same person. So they get the individual tax return done, and then they follow up with a trust tax return from that point forward. The trustee values property, date of death value. There's a few reasons for that. One is, we've talked before about the step up in basis. If the settlor had any capital assets that grew in value, something called a step up in basis, all capital gains are forgiven. And so we need date of death values to determine when the beneficiary takes over a capital asset, or when the trust takes over a capital asset, how to calculate capital gains and capital gains tax from that point forward. And also beneficiaries who inherit in-kind capital assets, they inherit real property, or they inherit stock. They have to know how to not only calculate capital gains, but in the case of real estate, how to calculate depreciation. So that's a trustee's job. Also, another very important thing is that the valuation as of date of death is important for the division of the estate. You sometimes see a settlor that says, hey, listen, I want my son to get my house, and I want my daughter to give the dollar equivalent. Well, what's the dollar equivalent? Well, it's the date of death value. You have to do an appraisal on that property, and the son gets the house, and the daughter gets date of death value less any encumbrances in cash, in a very simple example. The values finally also need to be calculated for the possibility of estate taxes and state inheritance taxes, because they're based on value. So it's important for the trustee to get date of death values as soon as they can. I hope you're beginning to see that the trustee does have a big job. Now, many, many times the trustee has help with that. They have accountants, are very important at this stage, and often an attorney that might help them. As we mentioned, the trustee handles creditors. So if there's amounts owed, a credit card account that it is generally just paid off with liquid assets. If there's not enough liquid assets, sometimes assets need to be sold to pay the credit card debt or the unsecured debt. And trust me, creditors know when someone's died these days. In this day of the internet, creditors keep their eye on death records so that they know when to step up and ask for their money back that they've lent. The trustee may have to keep some accounts current. So, if there's real estate, they may have to keep paying the mortgage out of liquid assets before it's deeded over to the beneficiary. And they have to do some truing up on amounts that have been paid after death, real property taxes and mortgage payments, interest payments. So it gets a little complicated when assets are distributed in kind, such as real estate. So somebody dies. What are the trustee's powers? Well, they really step into the shoes of the settlor, so they can manage property, they can invest money. They actually have usually the ability to contest terms of even the trust or terms of a will, and they have a responsibility and the power to divide property either physically or by accounting. And I should mention, as I mentioned before, they have the right to buy and sell property. Normally, what the trustee does at this point in time is they liquidate assets and they cut checks. That's the normal process, unless there is some reason why they are going to distribute property in kind. So clearly what the settlor has done is they have named somebody as trustee who they think is trustworthy, since the trustee owes a fiduciary duty to the beneficiaries, and competent. They know how to do these things. They know how to buy and sell stocks and bonds. They know how to deal with property managers. They know how to deal with attorneys and accountants. Now, I will say this: there are many people don't have complicated estates. So a lot of times this is very simple. The trustee goes in, they liquidate all accounts, put them into one checking account, pay off debts, do the tax returns, and then cut 3 different checks to my hypothetical three children scenario. Now, I want you beneficiaries to understand that there are some complications to it. There are things that the trustee has to do before they feel comfortable paying out all assets. And what is very common, and you should not be surprised by this, is that the trustee will withhold a certain amount of assets to feel comfortable. So if they think maybe there might be, some taxes due again for the following year, and so I'm going to hold back $1,000 or I'm going to hold back $2,000. So don't be surprised at that. That is protecting the estate and the trustee who has that responsibility to do this. So that's what happens. Upon death of a settler, trustee steps in, takes care of all the debts, taxes, does the accounting that they give to the beneficiaries. And once again, they must perform their duties with the best interests of the beneficiaries in mind. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. I am going to continue this talk about revocable living trusts, sort of tie up some ends, go off on some other tangents that we hinted at in earlier episodes. Until next time, take care and have a great day.